Welcome to the Center for Asia Pacific Strategy's third roundtable in our Maritime Security series. I'm Lawrence Monaco, Chief of Staff at CAPS. As we pursue a deep and nuanced respect for social, political, and historical circumstances of each nation, we are excited to hear a regional perspective on the Belt and Road Initiative. Today, we will hear India, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam regional expert insights. Please allow me to introduce our moderator. Brigadier retired Andrew Cliff currently works as an executive consultant and program director for a global infrastructure and project management company. He works at the interface between public and private sectors, helping to recover distressed defense programs. His particular forte is in developing collaborative relationships. Over to you, Brigadier Cliff.
Thank you very much indeed for those kind opening remarks. I think you asked me to say a few more words about myself. I won't take too long because we need to get into the main gist of today's workshop. My first career was in the British Army and fortunately took me all over the world. I saw many interesting places on exchanges, training and operations. But it was my final posting when I was the Defense Attaché in the Republic of Korea and the Commonwealth member of the United Nations Military Armistice Committee that I think really started my relationship with, in particular, Northeast, but Northeast and Southeast Asia. I retired from the military and I was lucky enough to be accepted as a board member in CAPS, and that has allowed me to carry on that engagement. And every day, as they say, is a school day. So I continue to learn a lot about this fascinating part of the world. And I try and juggle that then with my other role, as Larry has said, in terms of project leadership, two very different appointments. But I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say today. We have a very distinguished team in front of us. And if I could just briefly introduce each of them, as ever, a few words never do justice to the experience and skills that we have before us, but nonetheless, it's a start. So can I start with Dr. Wijasinghe, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, with research interests in international trade and regional trade integration. He's also interested in the impact of adjustment costs on trade, of gravity modeling in trade, whatever that may be, and regional trade integration, as well as the trade origins of populist politics. So, Dr. Wijasinghe, you're very welcome. I'll give you a chance to talk in a moment. I think you're leading off some of our questions. Our second distinguished panel member is Professor Dare, and he is the professor at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, commonly known as RIS, if I have that correctly. He is also, importantly, the coordinator of the ASEAN-India Center at RIS. So, Professor Dare, you are also most welcome. And finally, our third panel member is Professor Tuong Vu. And Professor Tuong Vu is professor and the department head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Oregon. And he's held visiting appointments at Princetown University and the National University of Singapore, and has taught at the Naval Postgraduate School. And I would just welcome all of you, and thank you very much for making your time available. Now, before we start to issue out the questions, I've been asked to make a few further introductory remarks, and if you like, set the scene around the subject that we're going to talk about today. And that is to discuss China's Belt and Road Initiative, as Larry said, commonly known as the BRI. Now, this is a strategy initiated by the People's Republic of China, which seeks to connect Asia with Africa and Europe via land and maritime networks. And the BRI aims to improve regional integration, increase trade, and stimulate economic growth. And it is often referred to as the One Belt, One Road. Now, the name was coined in 2013 by China's President Xi Jinping, who drew inspiration from the concept of the Silk Road, which was established over 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty. And the Silk Road was an ancient network of trade routes that for centuries connected China to the Mediterranean via Eurasia. Now, the modern BRI comprises an economic belt, essentially a transcontinental land passage that links China with Southeast, South and Central Asia, Russia and Europe, as well as sea routes connecting China's coastal regions with Southeast and South Asia, South Pacific, the Middle East, East Africa, and then on into Europe. And the Belt and Road Initiative has 5 major priorities: policy coordination, infrastructure connectivity, unimpeded trade, financial integration, and connecting people. And the BRI is associated with huge infrastructure investment programs in ports, roads, railways, and airports, as well as power plants and telecommunication networks. Now, while since 2019, Chinese-led lending volumes have been reducing, and the BRI now places increasing emphasis on high-quality investment, including greater use of project self-finance, the use of risk mitigation tools, and green finance. And the BRI is increasingly an important umbrella mechanism for China's bilateral trade relationships. And as of December 2021, the number of countries that have joined BRI through formal memoranda of understanding with China was a staggering 144. That is a significant number. So really that's all I want to say by way of scene setter and background. And now I think let's move on to the important part, and let's hear from our panelists. And as follows standard practice, especially in these sort of COVID era where we're doing this online, I, as the moderator, will pose a question, and I will seek the views from one of the panelists, who I will nominate to lead off. I will pause at the end of their response, and if any of the other panelists would like to add their views, then they're most welcome, please. We have quite a number of questions. I would ask you just to watch your time carefully and to try and make your answers for what are often very complex issues succinct and to the point, as I'm sure you will. So I think without further ado, we'll move on and start with a question. If our panelists are ready, can give me a nod that they're all good to go. Sound is working, etc. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Well, my first question I will pose to Professor Dare, if I may. And essentially the question goes along the following lines. And that is, with the weight of China's economic potential behind the BRI, its potential for stimulating development in infrastructure is huge, is significant. But some of the behaviours associated with these initiatives call for an examination of the stated intent of BRI versus its actual outcomes. So I wonder, Professor Dare, if you could give me your thoughts, really from a sort of China perspective, if you like. What are China's desired outcomes from the BRI?
Thank you very much, Brigadier Cliff, for inviting me to join the panel. See, what I feel, the Chinese desired outcomes is rather mixed. There's a huge gap between intent and outcomes. If I may say, what are the gains that actually China from Belt and Road Initiative These gains are, also enormous. It has, I see the numbers and the number of countries they have joined, 144, you said yourself. It's a huge gain that China has, managed to get, like in trade, learning by doing. The Chinese whole engagement in Asia and Pacific, and also in Africa and Mid-South, Middle East. So they have, gained huge from the market access, also new technology, selling the technology, learning by, selling the goods, services, the technology through the new markets. There are many important benefits they have captured, the natural and artificial resources, for example. The taking Belt and Road Initiative all the way to the Africa, it indicates that it's just simply not selling goods and services, but also looking at the natural and artificial resources. Of course, beyond that, China's gains are also in the diplomatic gains, institutions building, and making new friends. So gains are huge, and these are their intentions initially. But if you look at the outcomes, if I may look at outcomes, more about the positive terms. Certainly, I said something that trade has multiplied, the diplomatic strength multiplied, the extracting natural and artificial resources from all across the world, huge, enormous, because China needs to bring all this energy to their own country. But losses are also huge. What I see in huge subsidy they indicated, and most of it, it is just they never claimed it back. So there's a huge non-performing assets. So lying with the governments, lying with the public sector units, the state units. So this is a burden, and economists will identify any non-performing assets which is not counted for. This is simply the form of a corruption. Then there's a bad loans. China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, intended to follow rules, regulation. This never came in. It's difficult, if it is a top-down, rules, regulation, norm settings, don't come in very quickly. And of course, I see, they have many friends, and also they gain many enemies. And many cases, the governance was never followed. So Belt and Road Initiative is a novel initiative, but it has, the results are rather mixed. It has picked up many friends. It has also picked up many enemies. If I say I'm from India, I can add here that India didn't join the Belt and Road Initiative Forum. And there are many political and other issues, which I don't go and discuss. So in short, to reply to these questions, my response is that it is a mixed. There's a gap between intent and outcomes, but certainly we are looking at it this time. If you look in horizon would be the more, maybe the results will be different. So I stop here. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, I nearly made the mistake of talking without my microphone being on, but I just managed to catch it. So, Professor Dare, thank you very much for your answer. And I suppose in summary, or what I took away from that, it's not just selling goods and services. It's a learning experience, which is an interesting concept. It's getting access to resources, which of course then get fed back into goods and services, as well as the diplomatic gains and the sort of new friends, if you like. But of course, all that not without risk of waste, risk of or waste through corruption as well. So, Professor Dare, thank you very much indeed for your answer. If you like, we'll keep you in the spotlight for the next question, and then I'll move around to the other panel members. And I suppose let's switch positions for a moment. So rather than what are China's ambitions, what do you think from a nation, not just your own, but other nations as well? What do you think the opportunities and the risks are associated with signing a BRI memorandum of understanding with China?
All right. Look, the opportunities, as I said, is huge. Regional connectivity programs, regional infrastructure, be it hardware or software, it brings medium to long-term huge benefits for the economic growth, economic development. So those countries who are signing the BRI with China, for them, they must have seen it. There are opportunities. That's why they're coming forward. To me, the literature, the statistical information all indicates that the opportunities for them, supply side, because most of the developing countries, least developed countries, there are constraints at the border. They face enormous infrastructure shortage. So in case China is giving them a high-speed railway system for them, which they never can imagine that they can build it in their whole lifetime. So it is a kind of a gain for them. Of course, I'm not going there for financial term. So in terms of, from the supply side of economics, there are merits for Belt and Road Initiative. Transportation, there are merits. Trade, diplomatic, new goods, new services, rules and norms, economic growth, production networks, which you call the value chains. So these are the opportunities. And if you look at some of the countries, through which, through whom China has introduced the BRI projects, some of them actually came out with a very short-term benefits in terms of their trade and investment networks. And those are very much there in the Malaysia, so also Thailand, so also other Southeast Asian countries. Risks are there, of course, because the Belt and Road Initiative is not just a kind of a free lunch. The countries, they have to borrow money. There could be some little bit amount of technical assistance and grant, but there are huge amount of risks. Great example is Sri Lanka, and the co-panelist from Sri Lanka would share his perspective. But there are risks as well, because the countries need to borrow at a certain conditions, and if the conditions, particularly smaller economies, islands, landlocked countries, if they fail to pay and they fail to make the system work for them, then there could be bankruptcies. That's what we have seen in that case. Handing over the assets to the BRI projects are also there. That is why the security threats as well. And many countries actually later on withdrawn or restructured the program with the BRIs. And sometimes I see, the loss of sovereignty. The countries who said, fine, come here, invest. I will get from trade facilitation, transport facilitation. Later on, the non-traditional security threats, drugs, human trafficking, all those are there, in risk. They actually create lots of noises and pollutions. Besides conflicts, adapting to low equilibrium trade arrangements, low level of product standards, those are, and also the political nepotism. Those use a risk, countries, they know it very well. So one side, anything, large infrastructure projects, they bring very straightforward economic opportunities. These are there in the Belt and Road Initiatives. At the same time, it also carries the risks, which are on the other end. So there's a clear trade-offs. And I think this is very common when you come to regional infrastructure and connectivity. But we need to see the project-wise, country-wise, what's exactly happened. It's kind of an ex post analysis, which I haven't done. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor Dad. I mean, that was a great tour de force. So, opportunities, as you said, is this sort of high-speed access to infrastructure that otherwise might take generations to realize. And of course, that can help underpin growth. But there is a downside, as you said, loss of sovereignty, drugs, crime, political nepotism, as you succinctly said, no such thing as a free lunch. There are strings attached. Thank you very much indeed. So final question, if I could, Professor. Clearly the BRI appears to be a successful vehicle for growing regional infrastructure, as well as cementing Chinese influence. But let's stand back for a moment. What other options are available to existing institutions and democratic interests as an alternative to BRI? So, what else can nations turn to rather than BRI?
Well, there are plenty of options. It is not that nothing is available to as an alternate to the BRI. Look, first of all, what the countries actually need in the post-COVID. We need a new paradigm for trade, for governance, for public health, sharing the common resources and distribution. Now, this Belt and Road Initiative, which actually started in 2013 onward, this is primarily building physical infrastructure. Well, later on, the BRI projects linked to the software side, which is basically sustainable development goal and etc. But if you look at the BRI today and its counter organizations as an alternate options, so I need to tell you that organization or institutions as an alternative to BRI should be looking at the new agenda for the global governance. Now, existing institutions, we have a number is very limited. This is either Asian Development Bank or Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, New Development Bank, or the World Bank. These are 4 or 5 organizations in Asia Pacific. They come and they do the similar kind of project financing, co-financing. Now with them, and there is some numbers which just available. If it's $120 billion is per annum requirement per annum per year requirement 120 billion in developing Asia. Including island and least developed countries, which are very vulnerable to climate change. So if you count the climate change issues, if you look at the new agenda for the global governance, existing infrastructure, their assets, their capability can be scaled up, provided the member countries they have honest attempts. If not, what I see that very recently, I see in a strategy paper came out in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is in the American and the government is looking at an alternate to the BRI, where they have talked about similar kind of arrangements. So in short, as a viable option for the BRI at the moment, the path is not very clear, but if there is an honest attempt by the member countries, who are looking at as alternate option to the BRI, there are available options within the existing organizations to scale up their assets, to build new organizations, which is being discussed in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Let's see, what's actually time in the coming times, and then we will look at it, the requirements, and probably will be able to best answer these questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Dare. So, essentially, I took from that there are other options. Some of them may not be immediately apparent, and sort of some innovative thinking is perhaps required to present maybe a credible option to the BRI. That's certainly what I thought I was picking up, but thank you very much. Shall we move on? Dr. Wijasinghe, if I could turn to you, please, and really ask for your perspective on what are the upsides and the downside for Sri Lanka with respect to Sri Lanka's BRI experience.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, for the question. Actually, as you explained, there are 2 components in this BRI. One is the Silk Road Economic Belt, and the other is the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. Sri Lanka is a part of this second approach, actually. China is building a port, was building a port, and it is operational right now in Hambantota. However, even before 2013, China was investing and providing loans to projects in Sri Lanka. Pre-BRI period, China provided loan to build a power plant in Sri Lanka. It's Norchole coal power plant, and also the Colombo International Container Terminal. It is very lucrative business venture, one of the deepest port in the Asian region. after that, before and after this BRI period, China has invested and provided loans amounting to about 13 billion US dollars. So if we talk about the advantage from these projects, one thing is the internal connectivity. Chinese funded highway system connected the deep south with the capital city, and from our major airport Katunayak to Colombo there was a highway. So this kind of internal connectivity was one major advantage of these projects. We liberalized our economy in 1977. We opened up to the world, but the problem was infrastructure was identified as a bottleneck for foreign direct investment. So successive governments wanted to develop infrastructure. Most of these dedicated economic zones, especially for the ready-made garment, they were located close to Colombo, the capital. Successive governments tried to bring those garment factories to the rural areas, but they were not much successful due to these infrastructure problems. So Chinese funds were useful to build road networks, ports, airports, solving this infrastructure issue. The other thing is that so these kind of investments actually build a conducive environment for foreign direct investment. These projects are innovative and some are actually eco-friendly. As an example, this is a Colombo International Container Terminal. They are using electrically powered cranes. So their diesel consumption is about 96% lower. So they innovate. That's a good thing for our economy. So these projects increase the capacity of our economy. As an example, this deep seawater ports and terminals. This Colombo International Container Terminal, it is about 18 meters deep. And it is one of the few ports in the Asian region which can handle 22,000 TEU vessels. So it increases our economic capacity. Other thing is the coal power plant. It is largest in the country. It provides about 900 megawatts. It's a significant portion of our national grid. One major downside is the concern on the economic return. Though there is this immense economic potential of these projects, there is a huge debate whether we got much return from these projects. Initially, with these investments, we had high economic growth, but it did not sustain. That means that these projects did not increase the economic productivity and efficiency. That's a major concern. The other thing is the geopolitical anxiety. So Sri Lanka is kind of caught in between these geopolitical anxieties. So Sri Lanka's foreign policy has become really complex because of this. Finally, we had some discussions with the local communities. They do not think that they were benefited from these projects. As an example, they don't think they got enough employment opportunities. And we talked with business firms. They said they are not even purchasing inputs from those areas for their business. So this kind of dislocation is there. So these are the negative aspects of these projects. Thank you.
Brilliant. Dr. Wijesinghe, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I was busily scribbling away there. The key advantage seemed to be this internal connectivity, which really helped drive the economy as you opened the economy up in the 70s, and you gave a whole range of examples from deep water ports, coal-fired power generation, etc. And the downsides, actually productivity and efficiency did not improve particularly, so presumably quite a lot of waste. It complicated your if you like, your foreign policy as you were juggling various wars on your support, and also that much of that benefit was not felt at a low level. So, people didn't necessarily see their lives enriched, improved, or whatever. Thank you very much indeed. That's really interesting. So, if I could, Dr. Wijesinga, fire another question towards you. And it's about the Colombo port city. I think probably expecting this one. There is much speculation surrounding China's seeming absolute control of the Colombo port city, which is 700 kilometers away from Chennai, if I pronounce that correctly. And there's also associated with a 99-year lease of the Hambantota port, with the 15,000 acres of land around it. So given that speculation, concern, I suppose, is perhaps another term, how do you think Sri Lanka views these developments?
That when you look at these BRI projects, actually, the academic literature says that there are two motives. One is the economic objectives of China. One key objective is to get rid of their industrial overcapacity, so they can build ports, railways, and infrastructure projects using their surplus production. The other thing is strategic concerns. But I think due to the geopolitical rivalry between the major powers, the opponents, the rival nations, they look at this from a geopolitical perspective, not economic perspective. That could be a reason there are much speculations around these projects in Sri Lanka. That's normal, actually. We cannot blame that. But when we look at these projects, China does not have absolute control, especially this port city. It is governed by an act passed by Sri Lanka Parliament, and there were about 20 amendments suggested by the Supreme Court, and that act was passed by the members of the Parliament. And Hambantota port project, actually, it was built as using loan from China. Then due to this reserve crisis, economic crisis in Sri Lanka discussed and came into a deal with China. What they did was they built a company. It's a 70% stakes are from Chinese firm and 30% for Sri Lanka Port Authority. So now that project is governed by this firm, the joint venture. When in managerial terms, there is no absolute control of this project for China. When Sri Lanka's perspective, especially the policymakers' voice, I think they want to make sure these are commercial and open for investment without exclusivity. That Sri Lanka is not saying that only China can invest in these areas. As an example, port city is open for investments for all the other countries. And Hambantota port area is also, it's a free trade zone. There are many concessions for the investors. But I know that it is a very complex situation for the policymaker due to this geopolitical rivalry. Sri Lanka's strategy is, I think, following an unaligned foreign policy and keeping close ties with India. I think Sri Lanka has emphasized it many times. It will not do anything inimical for the India's national security. So time to time, Sri Lanka has done strategic rebalancing and opened up Sri Lanka for Indian investments. As an example, there is Colombo Western Terminal development and the Trincomalee oil farm investment. They are open for India. Sri Lanka sees immense economic potential of these BRI projects. I don't think Sri Lanka is willing or Sri Lanka can afford to be a part of the geopolitical rivalries. Sri Lanka has made sure that these projects will not be used militarily. As an example, in this Hambantota lease agreement, it is explicitly mentioned that the firm cannot use the Hambantota port for any military use. The security is a responsibility of Sri Lanka Navy, and after the agreement, Sri Lanka Navy has increased the port calls to the Hambantota port. And in 2019, actually, 2 ships from Japan and US, they visited port. That's a signal that there is no exclusivity for China. This is open. And I think in 2017, US Nimitz class aircraft carrier also visited Colombo. So the government is trying to show those signals. These projects, although strategically really sensitive, this will not be used militarily. I think Sri Lanka's perspective, they see it as, they see these projects as projects with huge economic potential and purely commercial activities. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dr. Wijasinghe. I sense Sri Lanka having to tread a careful path, sort of balancing between the sort of Chinese investments and all the benefits that brings, imposing conditions, nonetheless, things around military use, etc., whilst also trying to take advantage of other opportunities, other investment opportunities as well. So a tricky path to tread. Thank you very much indeed for your answer. So could I move to a very patient Professor Tuong Vu? Professor, I would like to ask you a question, please, with regard to the benefits. And if we start with the benefits that Vietnam has, if you like, achieved, received, gained from its relationship with China through its Memorandum of Understanding on BRI. Professor, over to you, please.
Well, thank you, Brigadier Cliff. Vietnam has actually received a lot of Chinese loans and aid, and it's actually the second largest recipient of Chinese official loans and aids among Southeast Asian countries. During 2000 and 2017, after Indonesia, it's the second largest recipient. And the Chinese have financed, invested in many projects, from power plants to high-speed roads to airports, seaports, to the latest metro line in Hanoi. And I talk a bit about that in a minute. But it's not clear how much of that amount of loans and aid, about $16 billion, how much of that is tied to the BRI, as this is a very sensitive issue in Vietnamese politics. As you may have known, anything Chinese in Vietnam is quite unpopular these days, including and maybe especially Chinese investment, because the Vietnamese people, many of them, believe that China wants to dominate Vietnam, China wants to subjugate Vietnam, wants to turn Vietnam into a Chinese colony. So they're very, very kind of, unsupportive. They don't appreciate the Chinese intervention or investment at all. That's why the government has not disclosed the extent that Vietnam is dependent on China, even though Chinese capital has contributed to the development of Vietnamese infrastructure. We don't know, and we don't know how much, and that's not appreciated because of the politics. And it has actually, I can give examples of how the Vietnamese don't appreciate, actually resent Chinese investment. An example is the draft law on special economic zones that the government was trying to pass in 2018. And so the law was to create 3 special economic zones, one in northern Vietnam, very close to Chinese border, one in central Vietnam, one in southern Vietnam, that was completely open to foreign investors, visa free, duty free, you're free to use foreign currency in the zones and so on. And the Vietnamese people suspected that that was just a scheme to invite Chinese foreign investors into Vietnam. And so there was nationwide protests involving tens of thousands of people, in major cities in Vietnam for 2 days. And even though the government cracked down the protests, they had to withdraw the law, the draft law. And now they continued the projects, but then they are doing the project to kind of in quiet ways, not trying to provoke public protests. And a second example is what I just mentioned, the metro line in Hanoi, the recent one. It began in 2011, and it has experienced cost overruns, so twice the cost that was planned for. And it also was delayed for 6 years, and it was just opened last November. And this has generated a lot of criticisms for the corruption, the inadequacies of the Chinese constructor, and so on. So many problems with that project that really. Really caused the government to lose a lot of credibility and legitimacy as well.
Brilliant. Professor Tuong Vu, thank you very much indeed. So, I mean, quite a shopping list of infrastructure projects, but also quite a deep-seated hostility that is being brought out. People not trusting the purpose, the funding, the conditions that are attached to it, and if you like, the government suffering as a result. So we've sort of started with the benefits and actually started to touch on some of the sort of dangers and threats, but let's continue that sort of dangers and threats. So perhaps you could just give us a little bit more. How do you see this panning out? So, the investment is being made, infrastructure, albeit in some cases delayed, cost overruns. But what are the sort of long-term, the systemic dangers, the threats that Vietnam faces as a result of having accepted BRI funding?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So the particular projects, they cause more problems than just cost overruns and delays. There are also corruption involved, and like a lot of long-term environmental damages, especially with the case in the case of coal power plants that the Chinese investors have built in southern Vietnam, and some of some parts of northern Vietnam as well. So that's a big concern for environmental future of Vietnam. And I think my colleague mentioned that the risk of debt, even though it's not currently a problem for Vietnam yet, but it's increasingly a problem as the government is allowing the private sector to but private sector in Vietnam is not truly private, but most of them actually can operate thanks to political connections. So they're not quite private, in the sense of Western companies. And so the government is opening the gate for them to invest in infrastructure projects as a way to mobilize alternative sources of funding, but at the same time, like they can control the level of debt, foreign debt that these private investors may incur, and also the Vietnamese financial system is not that healthy to speak of. So that's a danger in the future, and then that's the danger of popular resentment and protest that I mentioned for the other cases. But then I think the main long-term strategic danger is that Chinese investment through BRI is creating division between Vietnam and its traditional allies, which are Laos and Cambodia. So the Chinese actually, China has invested heavily in Laos and Cambodia, and China is drawing these, former Vietnamese allies or current Vietnamese ally. Laos is still current Vietnamese ally, away from Vietnam into China's orbit, and that has serious long-term implications for Vietnam's security, and also not to mention that Chinese investment is creating also division within the ASEAN as a group, with China, with Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and to a lesser extent Thailand. And the Philippines kind of in a shifting position, but then you could see that China has successfully created divisions within the ASEAN that makes it more difficult for the ASEAN to act as a group. And Vietnam, when it confronts China on the South China Sea issues, it has often relied on the ASEAN to counter China, to balance against China. But then, with ASEAN divided, with some members of ASEAN actually supporting the Chinese position, it's more difficult for Vietnam to actually kind of get ASEAN support for its position. So that's kind of a long-term strategic concern for Vietnam. And the last one concerns the fact that by establishing by gaining diplomatically, establishing occupying strategic locations, from Cambodia port to Myanmar's port to Sri Lankan ports. So China is kind of creating a chain of control throughout the South China Sea and the Indian Sea, the Indian Ocean, that makes it much easier for China if one day China decides to take over the Spratly from Vietnam entirely. So China has been threatening, Vietnam's position, on the Spratly Islands. And if China is successful in creating, a chain of logistic supplies and a chain of command across the South China Sea and all the way to the Indian Ocean and so on, that would make it very easy for China to take control of those islands. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor Tong Vu. So in terms of the sort of short-term impact, negative impacts, corruption, debt, popular resentment, driving division, both division amongst Vietnam's normal allies, Laos and Cambodia, but also more broadly amongst ASEAN countries. And then your final point, well made, about seizing and holding strategic locations, in turn building up sort of control over important trade routes across certainly that part of the world and linking to others. Thank you. Gentlemen, I think we've probably got time for one more question each, and so I'm going to move down to the bottom of the list. I think we've done pretty well. So I'll go in the same order that we started with. So Professor Dare, first of all, looking to the time, we've got about 10 minutes to go. So really 2 or 3 minutes from each of you, if I could, please. And then I'll ask for any final comments and then draw this roundtable to a close. So the first question for you, Professor Dare, and it sort of presupposes that US engagement has declined. And I welcome any comments on that. But the question is, what effect would US re-engagement in the region have? Now, you may question whether that's a fair question at all, but if you do believe that there has been a reduction in engagement and sort of displacement effect as a result of China's activities, then I'd welcome your thoughts on that. So, Professor Dare, if I could.
Yeah, thank you very much. What I see, there is a huge space also available for the United States and getting re-engaged in the region. Very much those countries who went to China's BRI, they also look for an alternate. There's too much BRI fatigueness. So to come out of it, every country would be looking for an alternate, particularly from the United States of America, where I think this US involvement is most welcome. And there is a space available for that, in trade, be it in the multilateral, global institutions, climate issues, digital economy, space technology, connectivity areas, education, particularly higher education and digital knowledge education, services sector, security related programs. So these are the areas which I think, Belt and Road Initiative yet to make an entry. And these are the areas where huge demand, particularly from the countries in the Southeast Asia, part of Pacific, and East Asia. So there is a logical move for the United States of America to come to this part of the world, either through Indo-Pacific Initiative or through Quad or other arrangements. So I would rather strongly support US coming in South, but they need to make it a balance. Too much of strategy is actually spoil the good intentions. So this also we need to keep in mind. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Professor Dare. I won't even try to summarize at this stage, but if I could move to Dr. Wijesinghe, and really posing a question about ASEAN and whether it's necessary, indeed, whether it's feasible for some form of collective ASEAN response to BRI, another alternative, if you like. Welcome your thoughts on that.
Looking for an alternative, I think it is coming from this game is a zero-sum game that one party should win over the other. Other than, I think we should talk about partnerships, not an alternative. China is becoming an integral part in the region. It is in RCEP and it applied for this progressive TPP, which Trump withdrew US from the agreement. So it will be a bit difficult to mount an alternative. It will increase the geopolitical tension in the region. The best approach is cooperation and extreme competition economically. In that case, yes, economic competition is better. It will benefit all the nations in the region. We can form alternative trade deals, open up our economies and link the countries through this value chain participation. Other than talking about kind of an alternative for China's BRI. Most of the countries in the region, they are in need for infrastructure investment. As I said, Sri Lanka, we have investments from EU, US, but they are investing in Sri Lanka based on this factor cost advantage. They are not much keen in investing in infrastructure deals. Japan was the long-term bilateral donor for Sri Lanka. So that's my opinion, actually. In the ASEAN perspective, I think they should find a way to cooperate and benefit from economic competition, not the geopolitical competition. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Wijesinge. If we could finish with Professor Tuong Vu, and interestingly, you started to touch on this issue in the final part of your last answer. And the question is really around, do we sense that China's expansion through BRI will eventually, if it hasn't already, and I sense you feel it has, will eventually consist of increased sort of military intervention, expansionism, etc. So maybe that's a sort of segue into expanding parts of your previous answer. So it's that military dimension. Do we see the BRI moving in that direction?
I think many foreign observers and analysts have noted, the kind of, dual use nature of many of Chinese invested projects, like ports and seaports and high speedways and so on, that that have dual use, that can be used, militarily if necessary. And so, but I think Chinese, BRI projects, they have a lot of military implications, but not really. We haven't seen, like a really Chinese military expansion through these projects yet, except maybe in the case of, Cambodia more recently, and Pakistan. That has had a long-term kind of military relationship with China, collaboration with China, and is, considered by China as its closest ally in the region. So besides, Pakistan and more recently Cambodia, that can be potential Chinese allies in any military conflicts. I don't see or it's hard to predict in terms of whether the military implications of the projects can turn into reality. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Well, panelists, we're nearly on time. So thank you for your responses to all the questions. Given the time, very comprehensive, a wide range of interesting views. Perhaps if I could just go round and ask each of you if there's any, maybe something we didn't touch on that you would just like to air. Please just keep it very brief. But anything you would just like to add, or a very brief summary, essentially given our subject is focusing on the BRI. So Professor Dare, could I start with you? Any closing remarks that you would like to make?
Well, the BRI original intention was to build a Chinese century. I mean, this is kind of a general things which I have noticed. But as you said very rightly, intention and outcomes. So I personally feel the gaps have actually widened, and the people who are looking at the BRI from the Chinese side, they are not in position to support it anymore because of their domestic constraints. So that's what, I think very much forthcoming from their policy agenda. So this is just kind of a summary, I can make it like that. Thank you.
Brilliant. No, that's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Same question, same opportunity for you, Dr. Wijesinge.
My understanding is that I think all states should downplay this geopolitics and focus on a win-win solution, win-win cooperation, because my understanding is that these projects can benefit all the nations if the economic benefits are reaped properly and these are implemented following the due standards. That's my view. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. And finally, Professor Tuong Vu, any final comments from yourself?
Sure, I'm happy to. So Professor Wijasinge mentioned that, like Chinese BRI capital is kind of the opportunity of a lifetime for many countries in the region, which are poor and have no capital or lack capital to do these projects themselves. But I think, the more important, like instead of thinking of, the West could counter China by offering capital to these countries, a more effective way to help these countries is to strengthen. You just follow the neoliberal classic kind of prescriptions, in terms of strengthen government efficiencies and effectiveness. Because when I look at Vietnam, the problems with the Hanoi Metro line that the Chinese invested in is not just that because of Chinese investor, but because the Vietnamese projects are also have lots of problems themselves, and they actually have a backlog of planned projects that they were so slow to start to disperse the funds because of the all these bureaucratic problems and corruption and the slow land clearance problems and so on. So the Vietnamese government is itself has money to invest in infrastructure projects, but then it just goes very slowly. So if you throw more money into for them, it's not gonna make it faster. Right, because they don't have the capacity to handle these large projects. So what they need is more kind of help to strengthen capacity instead of more money that they may just waste.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. Is the capacity to use the investment appropriately. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. We are at the end of our allotted time. Thank you very much for your answers. I think it would be, well, probably impossible, if not inappropriate, for me to try and summarize, because it's been a wide-ranging discussion, lots of ground covered. I think the only point I would make is there's a lot of talk these days about sustainability. And I think one of the things that we need to focus on is sustainable partnerships. I can't remember who introduced the word partnership, but and sustainable partnerships tend to be those which equally benefit both sides. And I think for stability, those win-win opportunities are where we should be looking, getting the balance right. Not all eggs in one basket, as we might say in a particular culture. So sustainable partnerships, win-win relationships, really is I would suggest, my limited understanding, where we should try and head. I'm sure there are equally as many who might disagree with me. So anyway, that concludes our third in our virtual roundtable series. Thank you for participating. I hope our viewers and listeners who will pick up on this downstream will find it enjoyable and stimulating. And I'd like to finally thank our distinguished panelists, Dr. Wijasinge, Professor Dare, and Professor Tuong Vu, for sharing their time and their ideas. And finally, look ahead. We have a fourth in the series, is In Commission, and we're just settling on the topic, and we're likely to be airing that sometime in June of this year. So until then, thank you very much, gentlemen, and best wishes to everybody. We'll draw this to a close.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.